Hi, I'm Oscar Bleetstein.
And I'm Charles Harkness, and we're from Parents in Action.
And we recently had a terrific conversation with psychologist and researcher Dr. Niobe Way.
We hope you find it worthwhile.
Her newest book is Rebels with a Cause, Reimagining Boys, Ourselves, and Our Culture. And we're delighted to be speaking with her today.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. And thank you to the two of you to making this happen. And to our ongoing conversation that we've been having now for about 2 years. I
At
think.
least, yeah.
Yeah, which is just really nice to be here.
Okay, so I guess our first question really is, why does your work focus so much on boys, and really what have you learned from them?
Okay, well that's a great way to start because it really frames what the new book is about, but also what my whole work is about. So the work on boys really started from back in the late 80s when I was a doctoral student at Harvard, interested in initially counseling teenagers. And so I spent a lot of time in high schools counseling kids. And what I started to hear from boys was a story that surprised me. So I thought they were going to talk about their girlfriends or their parents in their counseling sessions or their teachers or their little sisters. And what they really talked about almost exclusively is their friendships. And wanting friendships, wanting close friendships, feeling betrayed by other guys. And what I was stunned by is that not only were these stories that they were telling me not being taught in my doctoral level classes at Harvard at the time, but also it wasn't even talked about in society. So people thought, and they still think that even now, that boys somehow don't want the kind of intimacy of friendships that girls want. But what I was hearing is exactly that, and that was back in 1988. So then I started to actually be fascinated to do research on boys and girls and all kids from different gender identities and racial identities, et cetera. But to try to see what's this story about friendships and what's going on with friendships during adolescence, and particularly for boys and young men. And what I learned over almost 4 decades, as you mentioned, and it's so important because I've been listening since 1988, which is a long time. What I learned from them is 4 things initially, and this is written about in Deep Secrets, my previous book on boys. And there's 4 themes in that book, and they tell us this. And this is hundreds of boys followed over many years. So because I'm a developmental psychologist, I don't just go in and do an interview with my team. We follow the same kid, over many years. Multiple years. So what I'm about to tell you is themes when we started with them when they're 12 or 13, and then we follow them until they're 18 or 19. So these are themes that from the same kid. The 4 themes are the basic theme we hear in 12, 13, and 14, and 15-year-old boys is the desire for emotionally close friendships with other guys, what they call deep secret friendships, in which they can be vulnerable and won't be laughed at.
So they're sharing secrets?
They're sharing secrets. And they explicitly say that, Charles. I mean, it's not like they just say, I want close friendships. They literally talk about wanting to share their deepest secrets. And so they talked about that and that desire. So that was really the theme that I've heard pretty much in about 80% of the boys I've studied. And that's including up until about 2 months ago when I told you recently, I interviewed another group of boys and they sounded exactly the same as in 1988. So this real desire for friendships, the desire for connection with other guys. So that was the first thing. The second thing was that they explicitly linked it to their mental health. And that was so important for what's happening now with our mental health crisis, et cetera. Because they explicitly said, if I didn't have these friendships, I would go wacko. I would want to kill myself. I might try to sell drugs because I didn't have anyone to talk to about my problems. They would explicitly link the friendships, the closeness with their mental health. Okay, so that was an early middle adolescence. By late adolescence, I started to hear a very, very different theme, but remember, it's the same boys. All of a sudden, the question about, tell me about your friendships, became as if I was asking the question, what's your sexuality? Like all of a sudden they started saying, I'm not gay, to that question. And I'd say, I didn't say you were gay. I asked you about your friendships with other guys. And so all of a sudden they were interpreting it in this sort of a sexual question, and then they would get defensive and they'd say, I have lots of friends, it's okay. But you lost that lovely, I didn't hear that lovely, loving, sort of vulnerable voice of the desire. I heard this sort of covering over stereotypically boy voice of, it's good, my friendships are good, whatever. And then I also heard the loss of friendships and how hard it was to find friendships in a culture that didn't think that they wanted them. So they started talking explicitly about their sadness over not finding the friends or not keeping their friends over time. So that was the third theme, and I called that a crisis of connection, and I'll talk about that later when we talk about the new book. The final theme is that the boys made it very clear in their response to my question saying, I'm not gay. or saying the phrase that is now been updated, but it's still a homophobic slur, which is no homo. So they would say, I'm close to him, no homo. We hang out together, no homo. And all of a sudden, it was about sexuality. And so what it revealed is a culture, right, that has sexualized and gendered friendships, right?
And this
the
was
need for
something
friendship.
that was changing between 12 and 18.
Exactly.
So did you get a point of when it changes?
Right. So what happens, and thank you, Charles, for pointing that out. What it became obvious is right at the point when the pressures to man up, right at the point when their bodies are changing and they're starting to look like young men, not like boys. You hear this voice of the fear of looking, and even, for gay identified boys, you still hear this fear because we still live in a homophobic society.
Mm-hmm.
So this fear of sort of looking soft. And so they would sort of distance themselves from their own desires. But the other thing we heard, right, within that same struggle is a lot of sadness, a lot of depression. And I have to say that is exactly the age, 15, 16, 17, where boys' rates of suicides shoots up to be 3 to 5 times the rate of girls at that point. And right at the age where they're starting to say, I don't care, it doesn't matter, or to say, I can't find the friendships I want. So the crisis of connection appears to have real consequences, certainly for boys, around suicide, and we can even talk about mass violence too. And so to me, those 4 themes, right, really led into Rebels, and just to say one more thing about Rebels, and then we can have a conversation. Rebels is really showing that the boys teach us a story not only about boys and young men, but actually about all of us, regardless of our identities, that we're all struggling to live in a culture, which I'm calling in my new book, boy culture, which is we privilege the hard side of ourselves over the soft sides, and that we gender and sexualize thinking and feeling. We think thinking is masculine and feeling is feminine, when it's just a human thing. So living in such a culture is creating a problem, a crisis of connection for all of us, and it has consequences, and they finally teach us about the solutions, which we'll get to.
So you've been studying this and tracking this for, again, over 4 decades.
Right.
How have you seen this evolve over that time?
Well, that's always a great question. I get that question a lot. So in some ways,
And pardon me for interrupting, but I just have to say, so, I have a 17-year-old son, and when I see him with his friends and with his football team, it is such a kinder, gentler place than it was when I was growing up.
Yeah. So in some ways we've progressed, and no one can dispute that, because in some ways, with more and more kids feeling able to come out with their own identities and to be celebrated their identities, so obviously we've progressed in a lot of ways. What's interesting to me is in what I'm calling boy culture, that we privilege of the hard over the soft, I am actually seeing evidence that we're getting harder. And so even though we're allowing boys to be soft in certain contexts, we're still ultimately emphasizing as parents, as teachers, right, as bosses, the hard side of ourselves, so sort of manning up for everybody. So to me, the difference is, and this is we see this in my data too, that it used to be manning up used to just be for boys and men. Now we're seeing it for everybody. And we're actually even getting data that girls and young women are adhering to norms of masculinity even more than boys and young men. Because they've gotten the message that if you emphasize the hard sides of yourselves, the thinking, the autonomy, right, the need for autonomy, that you'll get your foot in the door, in terms of where you want to go. So actually, to me, it's gotten better and worse at the same time because it's gotten more pervasive.
More ubiquitous?
Yeah, exactly.
So does that perhaps have something to do with social media and just more omnipresent awareness of everything that's going on?
Well, it's interesting because in some ways, absolutely. So social media reinforces these messages all the time. I mean, that's how it's structured. But I would really say the reason why we are getting worse in many ways is because we're not seeing it as a cultural problem. We're seeing it as an individual problem. So we think if boys are expressing their feelings now when they didn't before, for example, that we must be getting better. But what's still happening is that, right, we're still policing around. You can express your feelings, only a certain level of feelings. Don't go too far with your feelings. And then when it gets down to business, we need to be focusing on the hard side of ourselves. So there's some openness, but it's still an intolerance of all those soft skills we have, not just empathy, sensitivity to each other's feelings, thinking about each other's thoughts and feelings, being curious about each other. All those things aren't valued in boy culture, and we don't value them.
Backing up just a little bit, you mentioned suicide. which I just can't imagine a more horrible tragedy than youth suicide. But the statistics are that girls are significantly more likely to attempt suicide,
that's right.
but boys are, 3 to 5 times more likely to actually kill themselves.
Yeah.
What's the dynamic at play there?
Well, basically, because, very simply, boys are more likely to use weapons that can kill you, and girls are more likely to do things that are not necessarily kill you in terms of taking overdose of drugs or something like that. So boys are more likely to use literally, or hanging, or, horrible things that they do. So they're more likely to be so-called actually die by suicide. But girls are obviously struggling too, and I never want to pit. We're all suffering now, Oscar, to different degrees and for different reasons in some ways. But I would say living in a culture that only values one half of our humanity and highlights the other one half and mocks, right, the soft side that's necessary for human connection means we're all suffering. But boys and men in particular with suicide, because if boys and men are only told that to be a man, we still give this message, and I know this from interviewing boys 2 months ago, to be a man is to be hard, right? To focus on your stoicism, your independence, your desire for independence. I can handle it on my own. I don't need to express my feelings. These are all the things boys have told me for decades, is part of being a man. Now, this is the interesting thing. Now, it's a part of what we also mean by maturity. So maturity means self-sufficiency, independence, and for all of us grown-ups, we know that maturity should also entail having the emotional and social skills to have quality relationships, right? And that should be a part of our meaning of maturity. It's not. It's not.
So it's not being measured or factored in?
No, it's just when we think of maturity, we think of kids, leaving home and living on their own and making a living on their own. We think of independence and self-sufficiency. And the reality is, if you look at the divorce rates and all things going on in our culture, if we define maturity, 50% of maturity was also having the relational skills to have quality, mutually supportive relationships, right? Then we would have lower divorce rates. We're not valuing those beautiful relational skills that the three of us are showing with each other all the time, in our notions of maturity. So it's not only manhood, it's actually maturity now, which means it's affecting all kids, all young people, regardless of their identities.
So focusing in, just on the entirety of just the crisis of connection, all human beings. You mentioned in the book that, you write, we have to stop blaming social media. What did you mean by that? Because again, when we talk to everybody about this crisis of connection, social media is the first thing that people point to.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that, because I get that question every single time I talk to parents, especially parents. So this is the thing. We've had technology for a long time. So phone calls are technology. Writing letters are a form of technology. We now have a new form that's a digital technology. We've never thought that they killed us. We didn't like the telephone in the 1950s, but we didn't think it killed our children. So what I'm saying is that we've always had technology. How we're using our technology in the digital technology is what's causing the problem, not the technology itself. So how we're using it, I'll give you an example. The like function. The like function to me is the demon here. The like function that comes into Facebook in 2004, actually it comes in a little bit later. It comes in, I think, 2009. The like function comes in, which essentially how you make friends, essentially, that starts to model friendships, is do you like my post, right? Do you like me, basically, rather than am I likable, right? So the whole shift in the conversation in the youth culture becomes like my post. And imagine what that creates in terms of what that encourages to like my post. So it's about, am I sexy, am I pretty, am I talented, am I funny, essentially, right? Or am I cool? And that becomes the dominant way that they're sharing images, is basically to prove, like me, like me, like me. So that shifts the culture towards a focus on not being likable, but on being liked, which is really fundamentally shifting the culture. Is it the problem for technology? No, it's the way we're using it. It's our design function. It's the way we're using it. We could easily turn technology into we're going to talk about when we talk about solutions, into a curiosity platform, into a platform in which my suggestion is we actually put a design feature. I'm suggesting an owl, for curiosity, where you hit the owl and you ask a question of the post. Oh, where'd you get that shirt? Why do you like that color? Who taught you how to cook pasta? Whatever you're doing on your video. And the idea is to engage with that curiosity, which is a soft skill that helps, it's fundamental to building connected. So we can make technology foster, I want to say that really, really clearly to everybody who's listening. We can create a technology that fosters human connection easily. And young people teach us how to do that because we're naturally curious. We naturally have these soft skills and we can just embed it in our technology.
So you learned a lot about culture by talking to boys and understanding what their relationship to culture is revealing. How, as parents, how can parents learn about this? I think so I've got boys who've gone through the teen cycle, and I wish I had known more about some of the things that you're talking about, listening with curiosity. I think we have good relationships, but I wasn't aware of the water I was swimming in when I was a younger parent. So.
Well, I'm curious, Charles, for you, are there anything that I'm saying that particularly resonates with you in terms of your experience with your sons? Is there anything that like stands out as like, oh, that was true for us?
Well, I think that the how was your day?
Yeah.
Good. What happened at school? Nothing.
Yeah.
I never did a great job of prying that dialogue open. I do want to talk a little bit, and we can do it now or later, about let's call it helicopter parenting. Because I do think that's different now than it was 4 decades ago. So I'd love to learn a little bit about how you feel about that. And I guess I'll say is having gotten through that cycle, and my kids are both in and beyond college. I'm just aware of all the pressures parents feel about curating their kids' experience.
One of our parents actually sent in a question, which was, while some statistics suggest parents now spend significantly more time with their children than in previous generations, the result is clearly not happier, healthier kids. What can you counsel regarding sharing quality and impactful family time that will make a difference? What can parents do?
Well, I think in some ways I have to pull I always say to my students at NYU, I have to pull the microscope out a little bit to answer that question. We have to start from a different place and how we're understanding ourselves and young people. We have to stop, we're telling a false story about young people and ourselves, which is that mostly what we want is autonomy, mostly what we want is a sense of identity, that's mostly what we want. What I have fundamentally learned in my almost 40 years of research is what we all want fundamentally is to love and to be loved. And we all want each other. That's it. That's what young people have been yelling at me for 4 decades. So if we start from a place not that we need to foster their autonomy or we need to make sure they do well enough to get into a good college, et cetera, but we focus on if humans who are social animals, we know that from neuroscience right now, it's coming out all over the place in social neuroscience, we are fundamentally social animals. We are born in relationship, we thrive in relationships, we need relationships to function and to survive, not just thrive, but to survive. That then it becomes our parenting, our teaching, our bossing, as a boss, et cetera, should all be focused on nurturing relationships. The whole game needs to change. So the idea is if you see your child not as, I need to make sure they get into a good college, I need to make sure they are successful and can make money, but actually I need to support my child in having healthy relationships. And that obviously starts with the parent and the child, but also with the children, with other children, right? I mean, that has to be the top priority of parents, is to nurture their child's capacity to have healthy relationships, which means helping your child deal with conflict, help your child dealing with when someone betrays you, all those things that make relationships hard. So it's not just the flowers of friendships. What the boys taught me is actually that they have a remarkable relational and emotional intelligence, and they know when other boys are faking it. When they say it's all good and it's not all good, boys reveal that. They know that it's not all good. And then they know naturally to say, well, what's up with you? Like, why are you so sad today? Like, what's going on with you? You're acting weird, right? And then encouraging each other. Well, that's a natural skill. You hear it in 5-year-olds, right? 5-year-olds can read you like a shark, right? So the idea is if we're naturally relational, and this is the big point for me, we naturally have this relational intelligence. We naturally do. To actually connect to each other, that's a natural skill. And then we grow up in a culture like boy culture that doesn't value those skills, and then we start to lose them, we lose the skill. And so then we start to become less intelligent and disconnected from each other. So parents in the home, to get to your question, in the home it's fostering those, what do I mean by relational skills, relational intelligence? I fundamentally mean this 5-year-old sense of wonder of looking at another person and saying, not only what can I learn about you by asking you questions, but this is the kicker, right? What can I learn about me through asking you questions and learning about myself through you. And to me, that is human connection, and then you do it with me too. So Toni Morrison talks about what she was looking for in her novels that she was writing, is she wants her reader to read, to see themselves in her characters. And at some level, listening with curiosity is trying to do that, is trying to get people to see themselves in the other, especially when they don't necessarily look similar to themselves. But even if they do, if they're from the same family, see themselves, and then ultimately it goes both ways. To me, that's relational intelligence. Because it's not emotional intelligence, because emotions intelligence is oftentimes just focused on your own emotions. Relational intelligence is actually helping this happen.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? So the idea is that curiosity has to be foundational to what's going on between the two of us, and it has to go both ways. Right?
That was one of the most practical things I got out of the book, which was, when speaking to my son, don't just ask him about, hey, how's football going? How are your grades? But to also say, hey, how are your buddies? What's going on with this buddy, that buddy? And to just sort of foster that kind of conversation.
But also ask questions so when we talk to young people, now I'm drawing from the data from NYU students. When you ask college students what questions they wish to ask or they wish people would ask them, this is amazing. Everybody walks around with questions they wish people would ask them. So when you ask college students what questions they wish they would be asked, these are the questions. What do you value? What do you care about? Why do you care about that? Who in your family are you most influenced by? They're starving to be asked these questions. And when you ask them why do they want to be asked those questions, 80% of the young people in our studies say are you ready? To be seen as they see themselves rather than how they're stereotyped to be. So when you ask a question about what do you value, why do you value that, and why, what led to that, and what's your history of that, and where did that grow out of? People start to feel seen as they see themselves as a real person rather than as a stereotype. And we oftentimes, in our quickness, right, with our interactions, we're just stereotyping all the time.
Categorizing.
We're categorizing. I know what your answer is anyways because you're a guy and you're going to say this. You categorize me because I'm a woman, etc. Whatever it is. And so the idea is when you start to actually ask real questions, so not just the buddy questions, but also just asking a question like your kid, the parents always squirm when I say this, but for those of your children who are on TikTok, find out who they follow. Find out who they follow and ask them about who they follow, the influencers who they follow on TikTok or on Instagram, what kinds of posts they're posting, and not in a judgmental way of like, why'd you post that? But actually like engage with them in their curiosity of where their curiosity is, right? Why do they like certain influencers? Why are they posting the posting that they do? And this is the hard thing for parents. It can't be judgmental.
It can't be an interrogation.
Yeah, because the minute they hear a judgment in there, they're not going to tell you. But if you really say, I'm super curious. I did this with my daughter. I'm super curious. She had followed, this was when she was a teenager, but she was following someone that applied makeup and did it with, in a sort of interesting way. And I said, why do you follow her? Like, why do you follow her? Because she doesn't wear very much makeup. And she said, Mom, I love her voice. She said she had a very soothing voice and it makes me relax to listen to her voice. And I thought that was super interesting, that she almost saw it as a kind of meditation, to watch this young woman apply makeup and talk about it. And so I just realized, oh my God, I can't believe I never asked you that. I just judged you. Like, why are you watching this stupid video about applying makeup? You know what I mean? The judgments we imply. So ask questions about where your kids are, what they're doing. And ask them what they like and why and all the things. Even players in sports. I hate to be stereotyped here, but even like what players they like and why they like these players. And basically, just engage with them on their level, not always us directing what we want to know, but what they may want to share with us.
That certainly has worked for me with regards to Star Wars and Premier League.
Well, give us an example of that. Can you give us an example?
My older son has a really deep level of knowledge about professional soccer in England and why a certain player is likely to move and things that I know a little bit about. But, I know he knows it, so I consider him my professor around that, and he knows. Fantastic. He knows more than I do about that.
Yeah, Charles, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Going from where they are, and then asking about it. Be curious about your kids. Be curious about them. Why are they making the decisions they're making, the choices? And my son also knows a lot about sports. And I tend to sort of think, oh my God, it's like way too detailed. But actually when I start asking him, he gives me really interesting details about the different kinds of sports. How about you?
In terms of what?
Well, just thinking about just if any of this resonates or
Oh, tremendously.
Yeah.
And like I said, I wouldn't say I reconfigured my conversations with my son, but I certainly became more sensitive to the asking him more about how are you doing? How are your buddies?
Yeah.
Are you guys going out? One quick thing. I gave him sort of a credit card, a junior add-on credit card, and I said, this is just he's at boarding school now, for going off campus.
Fantastic.
And so go take a buddy and go, have lunch off campus.
That's fantastic.
And a little bit of, that was, I was thinking those thoughts before I read the book, and then that allowed me to crystallize it a little bit. Let me just Charles had mentioned something about helicopter parenting before. So let me just read a little quote here, and I think we'd like some more insight in it. Parents, this is from your book, parents often feel pressure to abide by the rules of their culture, which means, in the case of the US and many other countries, making sure that every moment of their child's life is productive, as they fear if it isn't, the child won't get into a good college or get a decent job. And we have kids Charles' boys have graduated, but we have kids in these very highly selective high schools and colleges. How do we think about this?
Yeah, so I'm gonna sound like an academic for a second, but the parents can follow this. I'm gonna share a very quick parable because it's gonna answer your question. So there's a parable of a tourist and a local that meet on a street corner, and the tourist says to the local, "How do you get to Grand Central Station?" And the local says, "If I wanted to go there, I wouldn't start from here." So the parable is, if we want to raise healthy children, we can't start from the place that the goal of child development is to get them into Harvard, right? I mean, we can't do it. And we can't get it to get them into, or not Harvard, but a good college, whatever it is. That can't be the goal of our child development. It has to be to start from the things what actually all humans want, which is quality relationships. So if we start from a new place in our desire to raise healthy children, it becomes obvious that helicopter parenting, which is really oftentimes looks like it's trying to be supportive of your child's success, but actually is undermining their autonomy. And autonomy is critical, connection is critical, but autonomy within connection. And in fact, if we have a chance to talk about the link between the two, that would be, I think, helpful for parents. But the point is that helicopter parenting is imposing your own sort of starting point on your kids that doesn't match what your kids want. So you're going to have problems. So helicopter parenting is not the problem that they're too involved. It's that the way it's like technology. It's the way they're involved that's the problem. It's not. You can't get too much parents. I think parents are fine as long as they're nurturing the autonomy of the child to do what they want, and also by fostering the autonomy, they're fostering the connection too, right? Because in all connection, right, we know this from the developmental research. In all connection, you need the autonomy in relationships to feel connected, and you need the connection to feel autonomous. When you see little babies, they won't explore the environment unless they're securely attached to a parent, right? When they're with the parent, when they're little. You don't see, for children that are insecurely attached, that don't feel attached to a parent, you'll see them cling to their parent, right? Because they won't feel the confidence to go out and explore.
And it's really those soft skills that help the kids get there.
Well, ultimately, it's the soft knowledge that autonomy is as important as connection, and that connection doesn't mean just smothering you, right? So connection actually means, if you were my son, Oscar, go and try that. I don't know what will happen, but try it. It may be a mistake, but then you'll learn from the mistake. That's a form of love. That's a form of love. To say, you want to do that, as long as it's not going to hurt themselves, but you want to do that, then go do it, and we'll see what happens. You don't want to join any team? Okay, so what do you want? You want to just play after school? Okay.
And while doing it, while trying, you as a parent, you have to have enough bravery to allow him to try to fail.
You have to understand, this is critical. You have to understand, I'm talking about the 20th century research, not my research, but this is all in the 20th century from developmental psychology. You have to understand that the best form of love is to allow your child to have the autonomy to make their own mistakes. That is loving your child. Because ultimately what they learn from the mistakes is how to do it better. And they don't learn that if you're constantly making sure they never make a mistake. Because ultimately what will look like they succeeded, they won't feel like it's success because they were just pushed into it. It's like, don't edit your children's papers so much, because what happens is even if they get a good grade on their paper, they don't take pride in the paper because they know that it was basically written by one of their parents. And I say that directly to parents, because they have to understand that helping with their homework has a double-edged sword, because the child does not take pride in an A when they know their parents were heavily involved in writing this. They do take pride in a B, right, when they wrote it themselves, and they know that, right, and the teacher said a lot of good things, you know what I mean? So the idea is we have to see that autonomy is part of connection. It's not flipping the hierarchy and connection is this, and autonomy is distance. No, autonomy is necessary in this connection.
So I wanted to briefly go back to your dialogue with boys and whether listening with curiosity, as you're describing, was something you used, or how did you develop awareness of that?
Well, this is really interesting. I mean, in some sense, I'm gonna fess up. Not really, until recently. And I would say I really learned it because part of the whole work that I've been doing since the late 80s came from me listening to young people. And for many of my studies, it's particularly young people of color from poor and working class communities. And I came in with a kind of curiosity to not just see the stereotype of how they've been represented. And so I realized, it took me a long time to realize this, but about 2 decades later, I realized, oh, that's the approach I've always taken, which is I'm listening to young people, not through how they've been stereotyped in terms of what their answer will be, but actually with a kind of curiosity of what do you know? And what you know, how does that relate to what I know? And then be able to tell a new story because I was listening with curiosity. And then we started to teach this method to young people, 7th graders, 8th graders. We still do it. We've been doing it for 10 years, called the Listening Project. And we've been teaching a method called Listening with Curiosity, Transformative Interviewing. It has 9 practices of listening with curiosity, which are all in the book. And we realized that young people were better at it than adults. You know, that they were much more connected to their curiosity, right, than we were. So that when I train doctoral students in the method, they think, when I ask them, what's your real question? What's a real question you have? And they'll say, what do you mean? And I'll say, well, what's a real question, you walk around with, of other people? And they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. And when you ask 12-year-old boys, you know what they say? This is what they say. When you say, what's your real question? That's all you ask. What's your real question? That you have as you carry around. Where do you feel safe? Where is home? All these incredibly intense psychological questions. And I'm talking about boys who look like the stereotype of the sports playing, kid who's playing with Transformers. I mean, I'm, childlike. And you say, what's your real question? And he'll say, where do you feel safe? Where do you feel safe? I want to know where you feel safe. You're like, whoa! But that's what 12-year-olds sound like. 12-year-old boys sound like. When I told them in an interview they had to do with me about, this was a long time ago, but they asked me if I was married, and I said I was divorced. And their first question was, do you still love your ex-husband? That was 12-year-olds. Wow. Right, a whole classroom of 12-year-old boys. Does he know? Do your children know? And how do they know? That was all coming from different boys, 12-year-old boys. So you think about our beautiful relational intelligence that we're born with. That's what boys reveal. That beautiful sense of who are you? And what can I learn from you? And in this case, it was about love, right? And they were probably thinking about their parents, right? And does their mom still love their father and all that kind of stuff. But that's sort of beautiful that they were thinking about themselves by listening to me, right? And so the idea is that we have this natural curiosity and then we just begin to nurture it. So when my daughter was in high school, I always say this, but I have to out myself. This is the confessing part, Oscar. The only question I asked my daughter, did she do her homework? Did she have a test? How'd she do on her test? I mean, basically, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but basically for 4 years, that was my question. You can imagine how irritating that must be for a young person. That you come home from a long day of 7 topics, tons of stress, and the question is, do you have homework? Did you do your homework? How'd you do on the test? I mean, she was going through all this turmoil with her friends and all that kind of stuff. No, never. It was, I wanted to make sure she was doing her homework. And I felt super stressed about it. So it was really at the end of her high school when I wrote Rebels that I realized, oh my goodness, I'm part of boy culture. Not just other people, but I repeat boy culture. in privileging the sort of, did she do her homework over her friendships, what she really wanted. And both my kids are still focused on, I have a son and a daughter. They're both heavily focused on their friendships. That's all they want is good friendships. And they're now in their 20s. But it's just interesting to me how we even fall into these patterns, Charles, even though we know better, but we still fall into them. Because we're nervous.
Yeah.
We want our kids to do well.
So I think it would be usful for you to explain a little bit. It's in your book, but thin and thick stories and how it relates to all of this. So
yeah, nice. Thank you, Charles, for asking that. Yeah, so I talk about the distinction between and thick because in many ways our stories about girls and boys and about gender and about race and about education have been premised on a very thin story of who we are. So the fact that, as I said earlier, we've turned thinking into masculine behavior and feeling into feminine behavior, it's a thin story because we all know humans think and feel. And you can't gender thinking and feeling. It's a human capacity and a human need. So we tell these stories, sometimes they're not blatantly false, but they're one-sided, they're a single story. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie talks about the dangers of a single story. Mm-hmm. And it's the single story, it's a single thin story that we tell of ourselves. So that, for example, that men and women have different needs. They don't. All humans have the same need, which is a need to be loved and to love. And that's it. And so are there variation in needs across people? Of course there are variation needs. But fundamentally, we all have the same needs. So when we get into this conversation that men have different needs than women and therefore they should be educated differently, no. If they should be educated differently, it means there's something wrong with our education, right? That we're not nurturing the human skills to do well, right? Mm. So if we're not nurturing the human skills to do well, then boys may suffer, kids of color may suffer, all sorts of things may happen in school because we're not actually pulling out, and I'm going to say a big word here, their full humanity. Mm. We have to pull out their full humanity in the education, and the only way to do that is to treat them with a hard and a soft side. Right.
And you specifically in your book mentioned that schools are a perfect place to nurture soft skills.
Yeah. Basically, if you think about it, I'll give you an example. Think about when you're listening with curiosity. So listening with, I'm gonna model it for a second because it'll be helpful for people, I think. Listening with curiosity is actually looking at you, Oscar, and asking you a question, what do you value? Let's say I asked you about what do you value and why. And when I listen to you, I'm trying to find the answer to my question. 5-year-olds do this. I'm actually using a metacognitive skill, which is a school skill. I'm listening to what you're saying. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about my own answer. I'm comparing, right? I'm comparing the two responses, and I'm trying to understand your perspective. So, but I'm not trying to agree or disagree. I'm trying to understand it, which means I have to distance myself from what you're saying. I have to pull the microscope out, and then I have to pull it into what you're saying. You get what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Super complex skill. That's a school skill. Metacognitive thinking is what we train students to do in any class, math, language arts. It's all fostering metacognition. So the skill of listening with curiosity is a form of metacognition. And I am convinced, and we're starting to study this now, whether if you teach interpersonal curiosity, not just intellectual curiosity, not just studies of the interest in the world around us, but the studies of interest in each other, that you actually start to do better in things like math, writing, right? All the kinds of more concrete cognitive skills, because it's like being bilingual.
What was the phrase you just used? The study of each other?
Well, what I'm calling, this is stunning to me, and I'm glad we have a chance to say, interpersonal curiosity, because it's been feminized and seen as a girly thing, is not valued in our boy culture. So we have a whole history of studying, I'm just coming out with a paper about, it's called Interpersonal Curiosity, the Missing Construct in the Field of Developmental Psychology. We have a whole field of developmental psychology, child development, that studies intellectual curiosity, right? And we think that's intelligence. But we don't think the skills you need for relationships is intelligence. And so interpersonal curiosity, which is relational intelligence, is actually not even studied. It's not even a thing in what we study because we don't value it. But think about how much the foundation of human connection and human community and human families are based on interpersonal curiosity. What do you think and feel? You know, right? What do you think and feel? We don't even value it, so we don't nurture it. So the idea is that the revolution in my new book really is that we have to have a revolution around fostering our natural interpersonal curiosity, which is defined as my interest in your thoughts and feelings. And then thinking about how you experience something, and it may not be what I expected you to experience it, and then you have to be interested in me too. So then we start to see the similarities and the differences in how we see the world, and what we know from the data, from my data over 4 decades, is that creates an incredible kind of connection when we both feel seen and heard and listened to, right? Because we're both able to express how we really experience something. That's interpersonal curiosity. It's only possible with our natural metacognitive skill. Do you know what I mean by pull the microscope in and out?
Yeah.
Okay, so to get back to your story for a second, so once we start to do that, we learn the thick story. And the thick story is actually the story of, it's not just the nuances or the complexities, but the sort of the fullness, right, of someone's experience. It's not just hard or soft, it's hard and soft, right? It's not, it's not just
it's
one.
It's not the Cliff Notes, it's the novel.
Exactly. That's perfect, Charles. That's perfect. It's not I'm going to use that. It's not the Cliff Notes, it's the novel. So that you actually get the context, the feeling, the experience, all part of what someone experiences, rather than the, are you a girl or a boy, right? Which is essentially the Cliff Notes. Right?
So where are we today,
Yeah.
with regard to this crisis of connection with our kids in these schools specifically?
Well, I would say where we are today, first of all,
It doesn't seem like a good place.
No, it's definitely not a good place. I'm just saying it's a global crisis of connection. We are deeply disconnected from our own humanity, and it comes from boy culture. Doesn't just exist in the United States, it's worldwide. We privilege, and boy culture, I want to be very clear, boy is in quotations because it's a cartoon character of a boy who only values his hard side. That is the model of modern culture. That's modern culture, is to only value the hard sides of ourselves. So in such a boy culture, it creates a disconnection from the self, because we know naturally, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds know naturally we have a hard and a soft side. We're naturally able to be sensitive to your feelings, and we're naturally able to be stoic, right? So in fact, when you're breaking down, I need to be stoic, right? So we're using our soft and our hard skills all the time. My sensitivity to your sadness makes me stoic. You get what I'm saying? So we're always using that hard and soft side. So if you divide them and put them in a hierarchy, it creates a disconnection from the self, which is depression, anxiety, right? All those things, mental health problems. Then you're getting, if you disconnect from your own humanity, you cannot see the humanity of somebody else. You can't do it. And that's how we're seeing in our partisan divides, our Democrats and Republicans. If you don't see your own humanity, you cannot see the humanity of somebody who thinks differently from you.
And you spend some time in the book talking about mass violence.
Yeah.
How does that figure into that analysis?
So and I'll try to weave that in also, where are we now in some ways. We're in the midst of, the new generation is called the mass shooter generation, the young people. We are seeing levels of mass violence we've never had in the history of this country. We're a mess in terms of our depression rates, suicide rates. Suicide rates, particularly among young men and middle-aged men, are soaring. Yeah. So we're a mess, and we're having partisan divides like we haven't had. I'm sure we've had these partisan divides before, but they feel very severe at this point in terms of the division between. It almost feels like another civil war in many ways. And so the idea is, why is that happening? And the mass shooters actually reveal why. It's amazing. In their manifestos, they reveal why, which is essentially they talk about a hierarchy of humanness where they feel like they've been put on the bottom. And implicit in boy culture is that hierarchy where we privilege the hard, but what's the hard, right? It's boy over girl, it's people too. So we have a hierarchy of values and a hierarchy of humans. And they feel like, even though many of them are white, middle class, upper class, white boys, the mass shooters are, they feel like they've been put on the bottom, and they don't want to be on the bottom. And nobody wants to be on the bottom of the hierarchy of humanness. So we have to stop putting people on the bottom and flipping the hierarchy. And I can't underscore how important that point is. We do it in our Middle Eastern politics, whether it's Israel on the top or Gaza on the top. We're just flipping the hierarchy, whether it's Jews or Palestinians, whether it's black, white, whether it's men or women, we're putting men on the bottom or women on the bottom. Women are historically on the bottom, but the idea is, the answer is not to then put men on the bottom if you're trying to, raise up the voices of women. So we have to stop mass shooters. It feels uncomfortable to say that, because they caused serious trauma to hundreds and hundreds of people. But they give us insight into how to stop the violence, because they say essentially, stop putting people on a hierarchy and then putting certain people on the bottom and not listening to them, not treating them like they're worthy of human needs. And so these mass shooters, it's not just that they're lonely, because that's sort of a thin story. The story is that they're revealing a culture right, in which we have a hierarchy of humanness, a hierarchy of humans. And if we have a culture that has a hierarchy of humans, we're going to be in trouble.
So,
right?
so you're saying that a typical mass shooter
Yeah.
Might have gotten to that point after having determined that they are in a hierarchy they don't want to be part of.
They don't want to be part of, and they feel very much, because many of them have been bullied. Many of them have been bullied. Many of them have been rejected by their peers. Not all of them, but many of them have. And they're angry. And they're angry that nobody seems to care. I'll talk about what I mean by rebels with the cause. What's the cause? Because it's related to this. They don't feel like anybody cares. They don't feel like, oftentimes their parents care, but those appears to be the only people who care. You know, their peers don't care, the school sort of doesn't care, and they're angry that nobody cares, that they've been put on the bottom, and that their needs are not being met.
And they've lost the ability to have a dialogue.
Exactly, and they absolutely feel out of control. And what oftentimes happens to kids like those kids, they get switched from school to school to school, which says, as all my NYU students tell me, when you switch a kid who's been bullied out of the school, what message does that give them? The problem is where?
The problem is you.
Yeah, the problem is you. So when you switch a kid out of school who's been bullied, I get why parents do it. I get why parents do it, to protect your kid. But the reality is it communicates the message that the problem is you. And so ultimately, with almost all these mass shooters, again, I would never make a broad statement all, but the ones that I looked at, which I spent many, many years looking at their manifestos and social media postings, has gone to many schools. They've been to many schools, meaning that they've had trouble in different schools. It started at adolescence, right when, like my data shows, the crisis of connection starts in adolescence. They think they're going to enter into, oftentimes, you know, if you think about white privileged boys, they oftentimes assume they'd be on the top. And then for whatever reason, and this sounds ridiculous to adults, but it's real for kids, they don't play sports, they're not fitting in with the guys, they feel rejected, they get picked on, right? All sorts of bullying that happens between guys. And then ultimately they're angry. And it does lead to a kind of mental illness in the most severe cases, where they then have the fantasy, this is the hard part to hear, they have the fantasy by the time they're immersed in their mental illness, that their violence will put them on top of the hierarchy, that they will show people that they can, right, control life, and that will put them on top of the hierarchy. And obviously it's a mentally ill thing to believe, but that's, for the most isolated kids, that's actually what they believe, right, is that violence will get them on top. And so then hence you see the violence.
So I was greatly relieved when I got to the end of the book that you spent a lot of time talking about solutions.
Yeah, good.
And one of the things that you wrote, which I underlined here, was healthy or mutually supportive relationships later in life can repair any damage done in early years.
Yeah. I mean, the beautiful thing, that I know this is not just from my research, it's from a century of research in my field. The beautiful thing is that because we're born so relationally and emotionally intelligent, socially intelligent, I mean, and cognitive, I mean, we're just born incredibly intelligent, that we can, negative experiences early on can always be repaired. All negative experiences can ultimately, with support, people nurturing your full humanity, can lead to well-being. So you're not doomed. If you have a childhood history of trauma, of abuse, of all sorts of things that so many people have experienced, of some kind of violence, the good news is, because you're born with these gorgeous skills, that you just need to have people around you nurturing them and beginning to see you outside of a set of stereotypes of a traumatized child, or of a kid who grew up in poverty and mother was in a challenging situation, to actually see you as a human rather than a caricature, right? And so once you're seen as a human, that has a profoundly, for somebody who's been dehumanized, to be seen as a human with a hard and soft side that's intelligent, just as intelligent as everybody else, but has never been given the opportunity to express their intelligence, it's a deeply healing thing. It's a deeply healing thing.
So how do you implement that?
Okay, you do it honestly. I know it sounds like I'm a broken record, but I promise we've been doing it in schools for 10 years, so I know. And we have data coming out, we're publishing in journals, and our findings are showing, if you begin to shift from what's wrong with you, okay, ready? From what's wrong with you to what can I learn from you and what can I teach you, and the idea is everybody has something to learn and everybody has something to teach. even a 4-year-old, has something to teach you, right, about our natural curiosity, and something to learn from you. So if you see your students, if you're a teacher or you're a parent, and you're thinking, what does my child have to teach me? And what does do I have to, right, teach my child? So that, and then also, what does my child have to, right? I mean, it goes both ways. So if you reimagine each other as everybody, regardless of race, class, gender, age, etc., has something to teach and something to learn, that means what it does is it creates a space that I can offer you what I know, which is a deeply humanizing effect, right? This interview, for example, you're asking me, what do I know? And this it creates an incredible kind of, you think better when you feel seen. We know this through neuroscience. You're able to make connections between ideas more when you feel seen. Oh, I have to tell you this one experiment because people love this. So there's an experiment that from UVA actually, and it's been replicated, standing at the base of a hill. Do you remember this in the book? It's standing at the base of the hill, and the experiment is that one condition is they're standing next to their best friend, a friend, a stranger, and nobody, right? And they have to estimate the steepness of the hill in front of them. And there's a real hill in front of them. This is done in Charlottesville. And if they're standing next to their best friend, they see the hill as less steep. And if they're standing next to a stranger, that's the condition in which they see the hill as the most challenging hill. So think about what that means.
More so than when they're standing by themselves.
Yeah, and by themselves, exactly. And so the idea is, think about what that means, that we are such sensitive creatures that if we think someone loves us who's standing next to us, we actually see the math problem is easier, we see the assignment is easier, we see whatever you're giving me is easier, because somehow we are feeling loved. And so our mind opens up. If we feel like the person hates us, we even did it. There was even an experiment where they had people thinking about people who hate them and then do a task, and then people thinking about who love them, right? And you saw the same effect. They couldn't do the task when they thought of people who hated them. So you have to imagine, we're such sensitive creatures that even who's sitting next to us affects how we perform on a test. I mean, it's stunning to me.
So creating space
Yeah.
for building muscle memory around curiosity.
Yeah.
That sounds like that's what the challenge is.
Absolutely,
Is making that
but
space.
but it's easy to do, because basically we even have a stats professor at NYU who's bringing in listening with curiosity into stats class, because it doesn't have to be about big topics that have nothing to do with the topic. It can be do whatever you're studying. It's a math problem. Okay, talk to each other about what you know about how to do this math problem, what you don't know about how to do. What can you teach me about how to solve this problem? What can I teach you about? And then what do you not know, and what do I not know? I mean, you could do it, you know what I mean? It doesn't matter the content. If anything, listening with curiosity is contentless, because it's just a matter of asking the questions rather than saying, I'm the teacher, so I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to assume basically because of a set of stereotypes that you don't know the answer, so I'm going to talk down to you, and I'm going to assume you know nothing. Guess what happens to the kid who feels that way? They feel dehumanized, because they feel like, hey, but I knew some part of that question, and then they feel mad, and then they've shut down, right? And they're not even listening to what the teacher's saying. So the idea is that it's a practice of relationship more than a curriculum or it's just a practice of how you interact with people.
So again, incorporating that with what you were saying before, it's the child who has to solve, to some extent, his own problem. They have to write the paper themselves. They have to, be present in their experience. But in some of the stories that did not have happy endings in your book, these kids were in negative loops. How do you bust out of that loop?
Well,
and how much of that is the, let's say again, the child's not able to solve his own problems or not able to, trigger a better outcome. How much help is the school going to provide, the parents going to provide?
Yeah, I mean, again,
you're
in some ways what I would call, in a cooking term, you're staying too close to the bone. So the idea is that we see in the Listening Project, when we do this 26-lesson curriculum in schools, for example, they become better writers. Why do they become better writers? Well, they become better writers because once you actually foster someone's hard and soft sides, their emotional sensitivity, right, which helps with academic topics, they actually become better able to express themselves. Do they stop making this grammar errors they made before? No, but then once you correct them, they get they care more. And so we see dramatic improvement in the quality of their writing, even though we don't work on their writing skills. So we see effects of, and you get this in other studies, that when you foster a child that feels seen and heard and listened to, and you value what they know, not just what you can teach them, they start to do better in all the topics. So you can't just start from, here's a kid, I'm going to pick on you, Oscar, again. Here's a kid who's not doing well, and we got to fix him, right? Can't start from there, because the minute he feels like he needs to be fixed, he's going to check out more. Like, screw you guys. Like, I don't need to be fixed. You need to be fixed. Right? And you can see that dynamic as a professor, I know that. But the idea is that we have to start from the broader thing is, how do we create spaces that people can share what they know and be open to learning things that they didn't know? How do you create a home like that? A school classroom of sharing what I know and being open to learning things that I don't know, and not, even if I disagree with it, that I still learn from someone else. So to me, creating that space is easy, and this is why it's easy, because we're born that way. We're born with those natural skills of that 5-year-old curiosity of wonder. So when I see in my classes, my NYU classrooms, they're all not wanting to talk about each other. They're all segregated by gender and sometimes by race in my classroom. All of a sudden, you create a space where they're asking each other questions, and before you know it, students, women and men are sitting together. The black and white and Asian American students are all are more joining together, because all of a sudden you've created a space in which it's about curiosity rather than about what's wrong with you or what do you know. You know what I mean?
What classification do you fit into?
Yeah, exactly. What classification you fit into, and then who's the best student, which is oftentimes another category. So the students who identify as good students sit in the front, and the students who don't identify sit in the back. And my whole thing is I get the students in the front and the back to start interviewing each other, right? So before you know it, guess what happens? Those kids in the back, they start moving up because they want to sit with their friend in the front, right? And so it's just, I'm just telling you, Oscar, for 10 years of doing this in my classrooms, it's so easy. It's just so easy. You just have to start with a new orientation. It's not about what I'm teaching. I teach lots of content. It is about what I'm teaching, but it's really about teaching it through the method of knowing that my students have a lot to teach me about the content of the class, right? But also about what they know about what I'm teaching them. Right? So they have a lot to teach me, and they have a lot to teach, and this is an important one, to teach each other about the content. And so really using that as a way to parent, if you have more than one kid, but even if there's more than, even if there's 2 people in the family. And so it's almost like a idealized form of democracy in many ways, but with the real sense of it's not about the grown-up teaching the young person and the young person having to listen and, please listen. It's about being open to what you could learn from your kid. And then also, of course, that creates a more open space for them to want to learn from you, because you've just said, oh, that's super interesting.
It's interesting because we, Parents in Action, have found this to be useful for parents to learn from.
Interesting.
So we do these parent talks where parents are learning as a peer group from each other.
Yeah.
So I think...
so what do you do, actually? That's super interesting to me.
Well, we have a whole apparatus to have a trained force of facilitators who go into schools. They'll get a grade together and they'll talk about what's on your mind as parents. So that dialogue perhaps simultaneously kind of has come to the same conclusion that it's better dialogue when parents are able to...
Yeah, and actually, thank you, Charles, for saying that, because I always forget that we have to also pay attention to the relationships of parents with other parents, not just with their partner, but actually with other parents, because that's a source of that's a resource that we underplay sometimes, is that ultimately parents are not doing their best because they're actually suffering themselves. SPIGs, depression, isolation, loneliness. I mean, all parents that I've spoken to have struggled with that to certain degrees. So same with teachers. We have to be serious about treating the mental health of teachers, nurses, right, doctors, parents, because we're not doing that. We always keep on focusing on the health of young people, but if young people are going to be healthy, the adults have to be healthy.
Right.
Right.
So we're nearing the top of the hour. I want to just make sure that we did get to cover where you're going next.
Yeah.
You've
Yeah,
learned
good.
so much about culture and
Yeah,
what
yeah.
it's doing to us. Where does it go?
Well, yeah, no, thank you again for the question because it's helpful. So the exciting thing that this book has gotten a lot of attention and the cause really, to very quickly sum it up for Rebels with the Cause, is to care, is they want to, young people are asking us to care and fundamentally just care about them, but also care about each other, and also take responsibility for the damage we've done. And when I say we, I mean adults, we've done to them by having a culture that only values one half of ourselves. Take responsibility and act on it, right? Act on this responsibility by helping them change the culture to actually a caring culture, right? A culture that cares. It's so fundamental.
I was just going to say, and I can't resist asking that one question, which, at the end of the book, you start talking about, young people are responding to this crisis of connection by starting social movements and political movements and, campaigns for the environment, like really positive things. So again, very unfair question. Do you think the kids of today will be better parents than we were?
Yeah. Okay. So let me answer that question, but I want to finish the question. Oh no, actually, maybe I should answer his question.
I think it's a great question. Yeah.
Okay, but don't forget your question because I want to say where I'm going because I want to let the folks know what I'm doing at this point. This is the interesting thing. I actually think because our generation, we're all about the same age. I think I'm the oldest one here. Has given very little autonomy to our children. So I actually think they are suffering from a lack of autonomy, and so I don't think there's an easy answer to your question. But I do think they are more aware of the problem than our generation was. So the fact is that the boys and young men in my studies and in my classrooms and the girls and young women and the non-gender conforming kids definitely are clearly saying to us as adults, what's wrong with you people? Like, we want each other, we want the friendships, we want connection, and you guys don't seem to value that. So they're clearly saying it, and our generation was so disconnected that we didn't know that was the problem. So I feel like they're doing better in that case, but they're doing worse because we've been hanging over them so tightly that their autonomy is not flourishing, so that they feel more afraid to venture out and to take risks and to do things that won't necessarily make a lot of money, but may make them happy. They're feeling terrified of that. And so they're not going into the humanities and poetry and literature. They're going into things that they will make money, but they're totally bored by, right? I know people that are majoring in chemistry, but in fact, they don't have an interest in chemistry, but they do well in chemistry. And I said, but you're really interested in politics. And they're like, but that will never make any money. And just that's coming from us, right? Our craziness. So I would say it's a mixed bag, but I really am, the book is really about listening to their cause, right? There's something I'm going to read and then I'll quickly tell you what I'm up to. But I think it's a good thing to read on this thing. I opened the book with it. It's a quote by Carl Oglesby, who was part of the 1960s rebellious movement. It says, "It isn't the rebels who cause the troubles of the world, it's the troubles that cause the rebels." And I love that quote, because it really is the troubles that cause the rebels that's leading to our crisis of connection, right? That we are a culture that fundamentally, and when I say our culture, I mean modern culture, but I also mean, particularly in an American space, a culture that doesn't care, right? That in fact encourages just do it, right? Don't care about what other people think and feel. So in terms of moving forward, I'm doing a couple things. With the Listening Project, we're getting state level interest, which is really exciting. So we have some interest from California volunteers in the state of California, which is exciting, and we'll see where that's going. And then we have very, very initial interest just 2 weeks ago from somebody who works in the administration of the governor of Connecticut. And so we may be doing something around the Listening Project with those two states. We have interest also from other states about bringing in the Listening Project into neighborhood initiatives, into the medical profession, into hospitals. So that's really exciting. And it wouldn't be the 26 lesson curriculum that we did in schools, but it would be a version of it to help build connection across neighbors, across nurses, across all these teachers, et cetera. The other thing is we're building an app. We're in the midst of, we got funding from Young Futures, and it will be the first friendship app designed for and with teenagers. We have 15 teenagers now in the midst of co-designing this app, and it's using the method I describe in the book. to basically listen with curiosity. It will be gamifying the method. And the idea is to create an app that actually nourishes our capacity to listen with curiosity, to use technology to help build connection. And it's going to eventually be AI driven, and it's going to be one of the very first, not the first, very first AI driven app whose function is to foster human to human connection. All right? To use
That's great.
right?
Yeah.
Isn't that good?
Mm-hmm.
So rather than to make AI human, which we can never do and we never want to do, and what AI doesn't have, and we have to get rid of this silly conversation that AI is going to be more intelligent than humans. They don't have natural curiosity. There's no natural curiosity in AI. You can teach it curiosity in a sort of thin way, but it doesn't have the natural 5-year-old sense of wonder. So we have to use that, what I say to kids, superpower of humans, that listening with curiosity. And then there's a set of practices that we can teach AI, we can teach the machine these practices, so they can actually help people listen with curiosity to each other, and that will be Agape Teens. It's called Agape.Teens. Agape means love of humans. And then eventually we're going to have an adult version too. But that's really exciting. That's really exciting.
I mean, I look forward to seeing where that goes, because that could be very powerful.
Yeah, I'm really excited.
Well,
Thank you
Dr.
so
Way,
much.
we really appreciate your being here,
Yeah,
and
thank you so much.
this was a lot of fun and very, very elucidating.
Yeah, wonderful.
So thank you very much for joining us. And just a reminder, the Parents in Action is a nonprofit, volunteer-based organization. And if you're interested, please do reach out to us and get involved.
Thank
Cheers.
you.